much to say. I cannot find the words, except for these. I love you.
Well, at the time I wrote Somewhere in Time, actually it wasn't called Somewhere in Time. The original title was Bid Time Return, from a Shakespearean quote. My wife and children and I were on a camping trip, and we stopped in Virginia City. In the Opera House there, I saw a photograph of Maude Adams, a famous American actress. And it was such a great photograph that creatively I fell in love with her. And I thought, well, what if some guy did the same thing and could go back in time to see her? And then we were down in San Diego at the Coronado Hotel. And so I decided I would set the book there. I actually stayed at the Coronado Hotel while I wrote part one and imbued myself with, I was the main character. I sold it right away. It didn't do that well. Steve and Simon, and now Stephen Deutsch at that time, fell in love with it.
I went into a bookstore and picked up a copy of this wonderful book called Bid Time Return, written by this man that I'd heard of, Richard Matheson, who'd written The Incredible Shrinking Man and other things. And I read this book and I was just enchanted. And something clicked inside of me and said, okay, I gotta make this book. So Richard and I had our first meeting in February or March of 1976, and we made a pact at that point that we would make the movie together. It took 3 years, from that point forward until the time that we could actually do it. And then in 1978, my boss, Ray Stark, called me and said, there's this director named Jeannot Swark who just did Jaws 2 for Universal. We should figure out something to do with him.
Just before Jaws 2 was released, I suddenly got a call from Ray Stark, and he wanted a meeting, so I went to see him. And he said, we have a book here by Richard Matheson called Bid Time Return, but nobody seems to really understand it. And I said, well, I'd like to read it. So I read it that night, and I called Steve the next day, and I said, this is it. I had an instant affinity for it. Matheson started working on the screenplay, but a lot of the people felt that the use of bid in the classical English sense, like Bid Time Return, it would be obscure for some of the audience. It was not a very catchy title. Then we talked a lot about Something with Time, and I think it was Steve Simon who said, what about Somewhere in Time? And everybody went, that's it. The script was sent upstairs, and then suddenly everything came to a standstill. Nothing was happening. It's like plumbing. Something was stuck somewhere. And then Verna Fields, who was the Universal executive on the picture, she said, Jeannot, there's something going on up there, but I think you're gonna have to go and plead your case. It's stuck somewhere. So I went upstairs to see Ned Tannen, who was the creative head of the studio at the time. And then it turned out that there was resistance to the project because they felt it was very non-commercial and that it wasn't crazy. And I must say, in all honesty, that on paper, the idea of a man who hypnotizes himself and travels through time without special effects to consummate this idealistic love after falling in love with the photograph of a woman, I mean, it was a difficult pill to swallow. And when I had done Jaws 2, I had told Ned, if I pull this off, because it had been a major crisis for the studio, I want you to remember you owe me a favor. He was very fair about that. He said yes. And finally, they told me that, yes, we had a green light, but they had cut the budget in half.
You got $4 million to go spend on it. And I said, well, how are we gonna make a big period movie like this for $4 million?
We had to find a lot of people who were willing to work for very little money. We said from the beginning, it was gonna be like Simon Stark. We're all gonna live together and there would be no privileged class. It'd be the same for everyone. And little by little, the project attracted people who wanted to do it.
Verna said to me, well, we got to put a cast list together to show to Ned. Who can we put in the movie? So we came up with a whole bunch of names, and at the end of the process, Verna said, well, what about this guy that's in Superman?
And then Steve and I talked about it, and I said, look, I'm sure he's been offered a lot of physical parts, and he's looking for something that will prove what a fine actor is. So we called him, and we went to see him, and we pitched the film. It went very well. It was a very good meeting. We hit it off immediately, and then he read the script, and he said, let's go. I'm game.
My problem after Superman was that I was offered many action hero roles, and that didn't really appeal to me. Somebody seriously asked me to play Eric the Red, the Viking. I could just see myself with a silver cup with horns on my head. But action-adventure wasn't really what I was looking for. I was looking for something very quiet, something very different. And I was just struck by this very simple love story that had the unique aspect of time travel. And I thought, as long as we can make it believable about how the character goes back in time, as long as that doesn't seem to be too strange or unbelievable, then I think the movie would work really well. That was my only reservation. I waited a little while. You know, thinking about that, thinking if I could make that believable. And then I decided we should just go for it, you know, that the notion of it was so magical that it would work.
Elise was the most important part after Richard, but it was even more important because it was filled with traps. First, the fact that you met her through a photograph, and for 45 minutes, that's all you saw. So I felt that we needed someone who had a lot of mystery. So we started meeting an enormous amount of young actresses, everyone in town, very talented. Every actress we interviewed asked, have you ever been in love? And the only one to say no was Jane Seymour. So I don't know if that affected our judgment or not, but it was interesting. She had the poise, and she also had the mystery.
Jane came in and said, I have to play this part. And I mean, I just thought that her commitment, her desire to do it, the fact that she was not even embarrassed or shy about making her desire known makes her very vulnerable.
I became obsessed with this movie. I read it and I went, oh my gosh, this is the one. It sang to me. It inhabited me, and it was the first time in my life that I just went, this isn't about wanting something. This is about being this character. This is someone I know. I have to do this. I went in to meet them. I'd dressed up in something slightly period for the audition. I think I had sort of a Victorian-y looking blouse or something, so I was trying to show them what I would look like, you know, in that kind of style. And Christopher Reeve was there. And Chris was talking to me, and I think we talked about silly things like the British royal family or something. I don't know what the subject was.
I'll never forget this. They sat together, and they were not doing a scene or anything. They were just talking and chatting, and there was immediately this chemistry between them. And together, they just looked like a real couple, and that was it. The rest of the cast fell into place naturally. We all had choices, but Christopher Plummer immediately became everybody's #1 choice for Robinson because he had the class, the poise, the authority, and also he would be good balance with Christopher Reeve.
I've always liked those sort of going through time, back in time pictures anyway. All the books that refer to that are some of my favorites. So the subject matter attracted me enormously, that one could play a character who was rather based on a famous theater manager and theater entrepreneur. He had a sort of soul, and he had a romantic education, and so he had a romantic twist to his personality, which made him a little bit more human than just simply being a kind of demigod of the theater. And his love for the character that Jane Seymour plays was perfectly genuine.
May I remind you that we leave within the hour?
Then for the companion, I was keen immediately on Teresa Wright because I loved her work in Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt and The Best Years of Our Lives. And she was in semi-retirement, so we called her and we told her about the project, and eventually she joined on board.
I did it for my grandson because the idea that I was going to work with Superman was, he was so excited about this. Like everyone, I think I fell in love with the story, the idea of going back in time, and it just was so different than everything that was going on in films at the time. And when I got there and did it, actually, it was interesting that the whole company had seemed to come to it for the same reason. They were enchanted by the story. And I think that shows through.
Are you all right?
Susan French I knew from Jaws too. And also she's an extraordinary lady. We had an enormous affinity, and she had this incredible face with this to die for bone structure. And I wanted the old Elise to be stunning. And I remember telling Susan, you only have 4 words, but everyone will remember those 4 words. Come back to me.
Come back to me.
In the screenplay, there is a witness to this story, which is in a way is the witness for the audience, and is a wonderful character, which is the character of Arthur. Irwin has this quality, which is you love him immediately. He's a very likable old gentleman.
If there's anything I can do for you, just let me know. My name's Arthur, and I live in the bungalow behind the hotel.
I got involved with an agent, and the agent saw this part come up one day, and he suggested me, and he told me that there would be one scene where my character was shown as a young child of about 5 years old. And so on the way to the interview, I grabbed a picture of myself at that age to show to them, and it turned out that they took that picture and later turned it over to the casting department in Chicago, and they found a little boy who looked exactly like the picture.
And I remember when this little boy came in, we just talked, and he had those wonderful eyes, and he looked a lot like the photograph I had in my hand.
See you around, Arthur.
Matheson originally set the novel in the Coronado Hotel in San Diego, which everyone knows from Some Like It Hot. And I knew the hotel, and it didn't work. There were problems with TV antennas and things we were not supposed to show. And then we started thinking about alternatives. And Steve Bickel was the associate producer, came in one day and he brought a book, and in the book there was a photograph of the Grand Hotel in Mackinac Island. I just fell in love with it immediately.
There was a sort of faded grandeur about the place. And the hotel itself had a feeling of being very much alive over the centuries. It sort of kind of winked at you as if, I've been around longer than any of them, of my guests. It contributed hugely to that feeling of going back in time, and did indeed become a character in the movie.
Of course, when we made the movie, we did get to stay at the hotel. We stayed down in dormitories in another part of the island that had been built for the Moore rearmament religious group that used to have their retreats there. And we all got around on bicycles because there's no cars allowed on the island. So everybody in the movie had a bicycle with a number on it.
We had to do some hard negotiating, but eventually we got permission to have one vehicle for equipment, and that was that. And all the rest of us went to work either by foot, on bicycles, or with horse and buggies. So it was very romantic.
Chris had his airplane there hidden, so when no one was looking, Chris and I used to sneak out in the middle of the night, like 3:34 in the morning, get on our bicycles, go to the airplane and take off. So we did. We flew to Toronto a couple of times, and they would have killed us if they'd known.
Just before I was to do Somewhere in Time, I was set to do a play, and I had to call the director of the play, Vivian Matalon, and he said, well, that's fine. I don't mind if you're not there for the first reading, but you must be there for the first rehearsal. And so as we were getting close to the time, and I was worried that we wouldn't get finished. Christopher could tell, and being a stage actor himself, he knew that I would be worried about it, so he came to me and said, don't worry about being finished if you're not finished in time. I personally will fly you there myself. And I was so touched by that. I thought it was so dear.
I learned to fly with Chris. He taught me how to fly, and we did everything together. We were like a little rat pack, you know, and we had a lot of fun, and we all kind of behaved like we were a bunch of kids.
The whole atmosphere of the plays and the fact that we were all together on this location really made us into a team.
And since we were close together and we had our meals there, we had rooms to rehearse in when that was necessary. We had a nightclub that we could relax at night if we wanted to. And so it was really a family situation.
The opening scene of the film, which is the party, that was shot on the island, if I remember correctly. Susan French was a devilish sense of humor. After we had done, we had to rehearse the scene quite a lot because I couldn't get always exactly. It was like the parting of the Red Sea in front of Moses. We all the extra seeing something on her face and opening up without you seeing her. That sort of tells the audience something is about to take place, which is very special.
Like that, cut them next time.
So in one of the takes, she just dropped the watch in Chris's hand and said, have it fixed here. It was very funny. I was very much aware of how important that photograph was. We spent an enormous of time deciding how Jane was going to look.
The photographer said that it was a very special technique and I had to look in a special place and then it would look as if I was looking at whoever was in the room at any angle. I have no idea how he did this to this day. And everyone was so intense because we hadn't started shooting the movie yet. I mean, this was sort of one of the major parts of the performance was that picture. If that picture wasn't magical, if it didn't summon you in, then the whole movie was kind of pointless.
Christopher Reeve had a request. He didn't want to see the photograph before, so we had covered the photograph. There was a little cord attached to it and a signal. You know, someone unveiled it so that when we got that reaction on that moving shot on his face when he first sees the photograph, when he turns around, it was legitimate. What I had in mind was like an invisible magnet, which was pulling at him, and he becomes aware of it, and then he turns around, and her face pulls him into her.
There are moments in real life when suddenly you see a picture or an actual person, and you're absolutely transfixed. And something comes over you that's very surprising. And you want to know more, you know, you want to spend more time, you want to find out more. And I've had that happen to me in real life. And looking at the picture, it wasn't difficult at all to have the same experience, you know, because she's amazingly beautiful.
When we discussed the scene, I said, look, I'm going to use this magnet approach that it pulls him in, and there should be a very ethereal light that falls on the photograph.
So we put some little smoke in the air, and we could see this shaft of light. And to have it flare out as he walked through it, I had the light set so it would hit the lens as he walks through the light.
But because we were not back in Hollywood on a set where you can do everything, but we were shooting in a real hotel, he was limited. So when Richard Collier, he's blinded, that was added optically afterwards to enhance what already was existing.
Is time travel possible?
One of the challenges of telling this story was to convince the audience to go along with Richard Collier in going into the past. We were all aware that it was the first time that someone was going into the past without a machine.
I did not want to have him build some metal sphere that he would go into, as in most science fiction stories.
And I conceived a notion. What? I asked myself, if I attempt to hypnotize my mind, suggest to it that it isn't 1971, but 1571.
There are scientists of some note who feel that there is a possibility it can be done, that there is nothing rigid about time, that we're on a time track.
I would disassociate myself entirely from the present. Move everything out of sight that could possibly remind me of it.
If somehow you could detach yourself from the time track, you could go either way, either go to the future or go to the past.
Your mind accepts this. Absolutely. It is 6 p.m. on June 27th, 1912.
I felt very strongly from the beginning that there should be no special effects, that what we were talking here was mind and heart.
And you will go downstairs and find Elise McKenna.
I worked very hard on that, and Christopher too, he was terrific.
Damn it!
Showing the physical effort and putting himself into hypnosis, the repetition, the passage of time.
For the transition for Richard to go from the present to 1912, Jeannot and I discussed it, and we didn't want to use any gimmicks or any kind of visual effects to help us to get there. We wanted to use it all in cuts and images.
What I was looking for was a little something that would tell everyone immediately he made it. And I discussed with Izzy that there would be a change of light within the scene so that if you're late afternoon, suddenly you get sunlight. So you realize that you're suddenly in the same surrounding maybe, but at different time of day.
What really helped getting us back into 1912 was to hear the horses and the carriages outside the window, which brought us into